Good morning. This is the House Appropriations Committee. It is Wednesday, February 26th, 2025. It is just after 10:30 in the morning, and we are gathered to talk about the Budget Adjustment Act and how it came out of the Senate. So what the changes are from what we passed in the House. So we'll have Grady Nixon here and Emily Byrne will be here shortly for the Joint Fiscal Office. And then at the end of this, we'll have a discussion and take a straw poll on a committee of conference. So that's the plan. At 11 o'clock, we have Doug Farnham coming in. We'll switch back to the budget. All right. Grady, welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Grady Nixon, Joint Fiscal Office. I think Emily is delayed in another meeting, so we'll start with language changes, the long document that you should have at your desk there. So you'll see in this document side by side on the left-hand side are changes the House made to the GovRec BAA, and on the right-hand side are changes that the Senate made to the House version of the bill. So in the center, you'll see Senate bill sections. And then we'll just go through changes section by section. So I'll skip over what the House did to the bill, if that works for the committee, and just focus on Senate changes to the House version. On page 1, so the Senate made a change to what is now section 51. This was House section 50, amendments to Act 113, section B 1100, the one-time sections. The Senate appropriated $1.8 million for local economic damage grants. This is the same construct that was used in last year's BAA to address flooding for the 2023 floods. So this is extending that same construct to 2024 flooding, appropriating direct grants to municipalities that were impacted by certain FEMA disasters. There's also a
Brady, on that, I had a note. Is there a chart of what these towns are? Last year, they were able to put together a chart.
There is a document of the towns that are eligible for funds. I don't have it with me.
Yeah, if somebody could send that to us, that would be great.
Yes.
Thank you.
The other change here is just a technical correction or adjustment to VHCB language. So they didn't change the appropriation in amount or intent. They just changed some commas to semicolons.
What page is that of your?
You'll see that I don't have it in the document. There is a section in the Senate bill that changes that language as well. That's section 91 in the Senate bill. You'll see that at the end of the document.
So it's just
changing, yes, just changing commas to semicolons. On page 3, Senate section 52, the Senate made further updates to the allocation of the property transfer tax per the administration's technical letter. So the committee might recall at the time, the allocation that was put in, there was a level of awareness that those numbers weren't final. The administration in the technical letter sent updates to that allocation for legislative intent from last biennium, and the Senate adopted those changes. And you'll see those changes on page 4.
So if you compare it to what we had done, we used the language that was in B1, the Act 113, which was the budget. They're using the percentages that were in Act 181 or House Bill 180.
I don't believe so.
It's a hybrid approach.
Right.
So it's what was in Act 113, and then the difference for the 181 money is the allocation based on the 181. So it doesn't move it a lot, but this is what.
Right. So everybody has more than what was in the original budget adjustment act, but some of them have a little bit less than what we had put in. But they all are getting at least what they need to do their work.
Yeah.
Any other questions on that one? Okay, thank you.
Also on page 4, Senate section 53, this is the amendments to Act 113 transfers. The Senate added transferred to the Emergency Personnel Survivors Benefit Fund per the treasurer's request of $220,000. There are two claimants that the treasurer needs to pay out from the fund before the end of the fiscal year. So funds were transferred for that purpose.
Lynn?
I thought there were 3 claimants.
Sorry, it may be 3.
Was this originally going to be in the FY 26 budget and we pulled it into the?
No.
No.
So this came in a memo from the treasurer's office. I think there was one claimant and now there were 2 new claimants, and there's a 60-day period where they need to, within that period, pay them out. So this just needs to happen for the end of the fiscal year.
Great.
I think that was sort of an add request to the 26, but 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
Right, I mean,
And very, very few people have access, have ever used this fund. So they don't have a lot of money in it. They have 3 people at once.
Yeah,
Right.
that's unusual.
Last year, the benefit was increased from $50,000 to $80,000, if the committee recalls.
Remember that.
The other change in this section that the Senate made was extending expanded ERAF eligibility for 2024 disasters. So this is not an addition of funds, but last year to address 2023 flooding, the committee and the General Assembly extended ERAF eligibility, so the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, to advance funds to municipalities before FEMA eligible projects have been completed, and to maximize the percent of state match. So this language just extends those same eligibility parameters to 2024 disasters.
Do we know how much money is in it? Was that in there in the budget adjustment, or it was just?
I'm not sure how much is in the ERAF fund total. I know that there's about $6.5 million being transferred to the fund in the budget adjustment.
Okay. Thank you.
On page 5, the Senate in section 54 reverted $6 million from the treasurer's bond redemption. So this is, the House removed the $14 million appropriation that was being sent to the treasurer to make up for that e-board action. And there was 20 million in that total appropriation. The Senate reverted the entirety of that. So it shows up here as a $6 million reversion.
Right. So we just were intercepting something going back, and then the Senate said, oh, there's still 6 in the Treasury.
Right.
The office will take that too. Yeah. Question? Yes, Jim.
My understanding is it didn't spend all
Correct.
of it. Where does the money sit?
On the bottom line. So that would be carried forward into fiscal year 2026.
So we have 4 million.
So I guess their idea would be to spend it as part of the fiscal year 26 budget.
Correct.
Thank you.
Section 55, the Senate struck closeout language that was included in the House bill. So this would have reserved funds for permanent housing, property tax relief, and other uses that are deemed to be in the public interest, and notwithstand the statutory closeout sweep that goes to pensions, et cetera. The Senate struck that language, so the closeout without that language would be directed as statutorily required.
Without this language, it would be statutorily required.
Yes, unless,
So we're talking about the 133 million would go 50% to pensions and
correct.
without this language. That's something to talk about. Okay. And this is the money that the governor was preparing to use to buy an education tax, et cetera, the transfers.
That was one of the uses listed out in that language.
Right, okay. Okay, I'm just making a note.
Also on page 5,
Say
Can
this.
you say this again? What does this mean? Yeah.
so at the closeout of a fiscal year, anything left in the general fund is statutorily directed to several purposes, including pensions. This language would have not withstood that statutory closeout language and held in reserve those funds for use in fiscal year 2026.
So I mean, usually there's not much left because we have a contingent list that, if there were, which there was last year, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So with this language, that money wouldn't go into partial pension payment.
It would all go to that.
It would all go to that.
Would all go to that. So every year we have not withstood a certain amount, and we had a waterfall, which was our notwithstanding.
Right.
So we had 114 million
Right.
that we said we're gonna do here, right? So
Yeah.
after that 114 million, there was still money left.
Yeah.
And some of that money went into pensions and some of it maybe went to OPEB, but it's all that kind of agreed
Yeah.
stat. So but we typically notwithstand some amount of it so that we can have money to spend on other things before it goes. And
So
This
would be
notwithstanding-
contingent?
this notwithstanding that we have, by taking it out, all of that carry forward would go to pensions, because there's basically, we took out any sort of waterfall.
And just for context for the committee, that waterfall or contingent language lived in the budget. So last year, the committee did not include this language in the Budget Adjustment Act. It included it in Act 113, the budget.
So it could also show up in this section C of the budget.
Yeah. Listen, I'm
Yeah.
all for paying the pension down early. But we also have to live within our means. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so this is.
Yeah.
The difference between what we've done in the past and this one, and I'll get to you, John, and then Tom, is that in the past, we've been very specific to say, you know, the first $115 million will be spent. And then, so that there's a number. In this case, we don't even have that number. And I think that's where some of the issue was. So, John and then Tom.
So you answered part of my question here, but what does this translate to in terms of money?
So this is that 136 million that's being carried forward into FY26. That without this language, there's no designated purpose for those funds beyond what the statutory allocation of it is.
Used for general purpose?
No, then it goes to the statute, which is 50% goes to pension pay down, and
Okay, just want to make sure I understood that. Following up on Jim's.
we could find that statute somewhere.
Yeah, it's 308, 32308C. I don't memorize all of 32 BSA, but
In
that's.
the, you can see the notwithstanding language.
Again, we don't know what it actually says.
So it's pensions, rainy day fund.
50% goes to the budget stabilization reserve, which is also known as the rainy day fund, up to a 5% maximum of prior year appropriations. So once you hit that 5% of prior year appropriations, then it sits, then the 50% that's designated for the rainy day fund sits on the bottom line.
Yeah.
If $137 million were to go through the 308C statutory allocation, there would still be money on the bottom line because you would hit the maximum in the rainy day fund,
Right.
the budget stabilization reserve. The other 50% gets split between the teachers, healthcare fund, pension fund, both pension, 25%, half of the 50%, 25% of the total goes to the teacher's OPEB, and the other 25 pension, the teacher's pension. Chris is in the room, I should.
It's directed this. The other 25% is just state employees,
Employees pension.
and with no maximum, because we aren't anywhere near filling it up.
There.
Right, right. So Tom and then.
So would this replace then the money that's in either the BAA, which I don't recall, of course, or the plans in the big budget for pension plus payment, our pension plus payments supposed to be in addition to whatever our,
Yes, that's appropriated separately from the statutory allocation.
and so this statutory allocation is saying that, are we saying that we're carrying this forward? Or that was the plan, was that we were going to carry this 130 some odd $1 million forward And this language was to say that we wanted to use it for these purposes. So we're gonna ignore the extraordinary circumstances that already exist that we may have taken care of with our normal payments, right? This would represent an additional payment on top of what we're statutorily required for the pensions anyway. Is that right? Am I?
Yes.
So there's the pension plus payment, and then this is a separate, just if there's money on the bottom line at the closeout of a fiscal year, it goes to these purposes, including pensions and the stabilization reserve. The two don't intersect though.
Unless we have a contingent or a waterfall language for those things, the money will statutorily go to the rainy day fund and the two pension funds.
Right, so that's
That's why this says
making an
notwithstanding.
assumption. That's now making an assumption that this is carried forward and that we're not spending it in this BAA, right? This is money that was accrued for this fiscal year. And had we not taken the attitude that we're using this money to pay forward on property taxes in particular and whatever else. This is money that could be spent in this fiscal year in this BAA because it's part of this budget. So we could put $137 million into housing, for instance, or for anything we so chose. But this is keeping the carry forward in place. Or
Yes.
is the carry forward in place? So we are,
If the way we left the house, we were keeping the carry forward. And it was going to be used for permanent housing, property tax relief, and any other uses determined to be in the best interest of the public in the subsequent fiscal year. So that gave us a lot, so
this
that
revision by the Senate
takes that out.
takes that out. So, and I'm not advocating for or against, but
Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand. So as of, if this became the bill,
Mhm.
all right, if we accepted the Senate's change, what would happen to that $137 million?
Without language in this bill or the Budget Act, notwithstanding the statutory allocation at the close of fiscal year 2025, what is left on the bottom line of the general fund would be allocated as statutorily required.
To the 50% of the pensions and the other 50% to the rainy day funds.
So that would require us not touching it.
Yes.
And assuming that what the budget adjustment has done is created an otherwise balanced budget. I mean, there might be surprises at the end of it, but this isn't going to count towards a waterfall towards the end of this year. So I'm just trying to understand. This is like, so this is just saying that we're in essence going to close out fiscal year 2025 with a $137 million surplus that left untouched. Now, this is the time that we would have to do it during this process.
Or the section C of the budget.
Or the-
So the Act 113 addressed this particular issue in section B 1102. So the contingent general fund list was in section B 1102 of the budget last year or this year.
Okay, and again, still trying to wrap my head around things. Some of the waterfall payments that were contingency waterfall was ARPA waterfall, which didn't happen.
That was separate money.
Understood, all right,
That
but
didn't
that's
happen.
still people made business plans based on the fact that they may be getting this money and things didn't happen. So conceivably, we could use this money in that direction as continued waterfall money. But it can also be used for the purposes that, if I'm not mistaken, this could be used in section C of the budget for the purposes that have been outlined, which is we wanted to reserve this money
Right.
for, you know,
That's
or
right.
some of us wanted to reserve this money for buying down the property tax or for.
Right, we can put this exact language in the big bill in section C.
And it might just be helpful for committee. The fiscal year isn't closed out until June 30th. That's why it was addressed in the budget and not the budget adjustment last year.
Okay.
So I think to sort of add to that, so when the budget adjustment passed for FY 24, there was an assumption that about $44 million would be on the bottom line and carried forward into FY 2025. But there was no language that directed anything to happen with that money. That was just assumed. So then in the FY 2025 budget bill, which is Act 113, is where we addressed language that said, notwithstanding 32, whatever, pull that money forward and we're going to spend it in the next fiscal year. What also happened, right? So there's this contingency list, and a lot of times why this doesn't show up until the budget. So I would say that this has happened sort of in that, I think one of you asked me this, like, is this normal? And sort of post-COVID, there has been more and more of this sort of one-time money that's generated through a revenue forecast upgrade in January. And then the governor's budget is built, or the legislature's budget is built, sort of understanding that there's going to be extra money in the current fiscal year, and it gets pulled forward into the next fiscal year. I think sort of prior to COVID and historically, right, there is a sort of revenue, you have to watch the revenues come like April, right? So what happened last year is we built the FY 25 budget predicated on money being brought forward from the prior fiscal year. And then April hit and the revenues were going gangbusters, for lack of a technical term. So there was more money than was anticipated. So the contingent appropriation list was created because we knew at the time that there was going to be a lot more general fund revenue coming in FY 25. So a lot of times this language doesn't show up until sort of later in the process when we have when we have a better sense of what the revenue picture is going to look like for the fiscal year. And then sort of make adjustments towards the end, right? That's when it's like, oh, it looks like there's going to be money. Let's figure out if we want to do something with it or not. And so I think because of sort of what's going on in FY 26, some of the priorities that the governor's put forward in the budget that you have, the 26 budget that you are working on, right? The sort of revenue forecast, the upgrade happened and some other changes. And there was a decision, you know, in the proposal to pull money forward sort of before, you know, we got to April and sort of like earlier on in the process that I think is typically when it happens. So that's also sort of what's going on here is that assumption is sort of earlier on than normally would happen, which is why the conversation is happening in the budget adjustment, which I don't think it normally would.
So I need to move us along, and if people are still confused in any way, you can talk to Grady and Emily afterwards. Have Doug here, and we haven't gotten as far as we thought through the budget yet. So do you want to quickly get through the rest?
Yeah, I'm happy to speed run this. So Senate Section 56 adds 3 positions, 2 to the Human Rights Commission and 1 to the Attorney General's Solicitor's General Office. There's $50,000 in the budget for the Assistant Attorney General position, and the Human Rights Commission has funds it can use in FY25 for those 2 positions.
62,000. There's an additional 62,000.
Right. Okay.
Section 57, the Senate added this section. It just makes amendments to position titles in the treasurer's office. So because of the expanded purposes of what was VT Saves or is VT Saves, the director is now the director of the Economic Empowerment Division, and the Communications and Outreach Manager is the same.
Well, that's just a title change on your position. Okay.
Section 68, this technical changes to the hub and spoke pilot appropriation per DEVA request. So the House made similar changes, changing the hub and spoke pilots from 2-year to 3-year. DEVA wanted to clarify that it wasn't that the program is not now a 3-year long pilot, but that the program will run until the funds are expended. So it makes that change, and then it amends an appropriation to the Joint Fiscal Office to allow for the Joint Fiscal Office to use a prior appropriation for consulting services. Section 78, at the bottom of page 8. This is a technical correction requested from the Treasurer's Office, just adding in the word "and." This was just a Scrivener's error missed in the House version of the bill. On page 10, The Senate in section 81 struck directive language that was being added to the Human Services Caseload Reserve statute that would direct the Secretary of Administration to transfer funds from that reserve to the Child Care Contribution Special Fund to stand up the CCFAP program. In section 82,
So, well, we'll ask them about that. Keep going.
in section 82, the Senate added that language not as directive, but as permissive language and limited it to FY25. So in fiscal year 2025, the Secretary of Administration has the ability to transfer funds from the Human Services Caseload Reserve to the Child Care Contribution Special Fund.
This fiscal year.
Correct. In section 83, the Senate added language from the Senate Institutions Committee, including in the request for a strategic plan from the Department of Corrections, that a business plan that should be included in that can also clearly identify alternative funding sources to address deficits. So it's adding in language to the report language. On page 12, in section 84, the Senate added in reporting language relating to stabilization grants for Medicaid providers. So this would be a report from DEVA to the General Assembly, or rather to the House Committees on Healthcare and Appropriations and the Senate Committees on Health and Welfare and Appropriations relating to the outcomes of those grants. On page 15, section 90, the Senate added language relating to property tax hold harmless payments to flood impacted municipalities that abated taxes related to flooding. This section doesn't come with, right now, I think the estimate of the ed fund would be about $1 million, but I don't think there's a final number on that yet. On page 16, section 91, the Senate added language just making those same grammar changes it made to the VHCB appropriation in section 51, which is amending B1100. This amends section E106 of Act 113 to make those same changes, replacing commas with semicolons. So that is just to make sure that those two pieces of language, which are the same, but for different appropriations, just align grammatically.
Right, so the money isn't changed. So here's what I think I'd like to do. We're back in that be flexible. We need to figure things out and move quickly on certain things. So what I'd like to propose is we have Douglas Farnham here now. I don't think he's going to take the entire hour, because we have lots of questions. And then what I'd like to do is have you guys come back and talk about the money and have us vote, but we need to do it all by me. So you guys are welcome to hang around or whatever you need to do. Does that work for you guys if you do it that way? Everybody okay with that? All right, thank you very much. Part one, we will move to welcoming Doug Farr. Have a seat. And we'll switch gears to FY26 budget. So, welcome, Doug. Thank you. I think we had four areas that we wanted to talk about that we identified when Dr. Princeton and you only had that on the days. So, and you have a list of what the four things are. Do you want me to do?
Yes, I do, Madam Chair. We have a laptop was like pull up the email from Aaron that
Okay. So, folks, if you want to look at the language section of the FY26 budget, that's where these questions are. The first one is is at the top of page 4 if you've got, if it's gravy information. 3 million general fund for municipal technical assistance program.
For the record, Douglas Farnham, Chief Recovery Officer for the state of Vermont. So yes, Madam Chair, the $3 million for the Municipal Technical Assistance Program. This program was established in the 2023 Budget Adjustment Act. It was intended to help support lower capacity communities in engaging with state and federal programs that were created by the American Rescue Plan Act, state fiscal recovery funds, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act. There were a large number of new one-time state and federal programs. And what I've observed in looking at historical data and in looking at the American Rescue Plan Act data is an administrative, it results in a bias. It's not a human bias, but our systems favor those communities that have more professional resources, that are able to prepare more complete applications, that are able to respond more quickly. And so we were seeing our program uptake was coming from communities that were larger, that had more resources, and we weren't seeing a distribution to communities that we wanted to see move forward with projects. And so the initial $3 million has been fully allocated. It is still in the process of being spent.
So on that item,
Yes.
carry forward funds. Area. And I don't know when the date of this, after last July, but it's showing a balance of $1 million.
Yes.
So you're saying all of that money has been spent?
No, Mr. Vice Chair. So the initial $3 million has been fully allocated out to projects. And in many cases, municipalities don't have the resources to start a project, and they don't have the resources to support a project. So what MTAP is paying for is 2 to 3 years of support in many cases to get a municipality through the project launching and management process. So the regional planning commissions are about half of the MTAP bandwidth. A little more than half actually went to an agreement with the RPCs to specifically support towns that were high on the Vermont Community Index, which I could, but a quick notes version of that is if you have social vulnerability indicators that are negative and you have capacity indicators that are negative, you're going to be high on the Vermont Community Index. If you appear to have a lot of capacity from your grand list capacity, other things, and then you have high incomes in your communities, you're going to be lower on the Vermont Community Index. So it's not about just small town, big town. Some small towns are actually very low on the index because they are very stable and well off and they have a good economy. And some larger towns like Berry City, actually Berry City, I believe, is somewhere in the 30s on the index. So for a city of that size to be that high on the index means they have a lot of vulnerability. So the $3 million from the initial BAA appropriation in 2023 has been fully dedicated to specific projects. Shortly before testimony, I did send a spreadsheet to Aaron, which you've obviously not had a chance to receive. It has not been posted, but it does show all of the projects that RPCs have gotten approved and supported through that agreement. It also, on a separate tab, has an unfunded project list of another about 1.5 million projects that we did not have the capacity to support with the first round of MTAP, because the other half of MTAP is supporting agreements with the Vermont Council on Rural Development, Housing Conservation Board's Rural Economic Development Initiative. Stone Environmental is actually doing direct water systems work under the MTAP program for towns. And so not all 3 million is going through the RPCs. It's about half and half.
If I remember correctly, I may be wrong, but I thought the original idea was to help towns with ARPA grants that they were getting. Maybe I'm wrong. And I remember the conversation with the 3 million in, you say fiscal year 23 GAA or the fiscal year 24?
fiscal year 23 BAA.
2 years ago.
Right.
Okay, so,
2 years, yes.
so now that ARPA is gone, where does the money get spent? Or does it just end up being, I mean, I assume you're not spending any of this money for actual project. You're spending it to, you know, a staff person at the Regional Planning Commission to help. Maybe I got this wrong.
No, you've got it generally correct. The main impetus for, and then the urgency, and the reason we proposed a program in the BAA, which is unusual, is that we needed to try to hit those gates to get as many towns in the door for ARPA projects as possible. And we have seen those numbers shift. We have seen a positive result from the program of more uptake in our ARPA programs. It didn't completely change the flavor, but it did move the needle a bit. We do still have bipartisan infrastructure law programs that are running, and MTAP support is helping those towns apply to those programs. Inflation Reduction Act is, of course, very complicated with the Trump administration's position on many of those programs.
Yes.
But there will still be some programs that they allow to go forward, and there will still be some opportunities. There may not be the same scope of opportunity, and they may look a little different, but there will still be many. And then the big thing that changed in 2024, and actually one thing that spiked a bit more interest and more engagement in the program, was the July 2024 floods interrupted our MTAP work, but then they catalyzed a lot of communities to come back in and say, okay, we need to get our project together. We need to figure out what we want to do. Because one of the categories of MTAP was climate resilience and mitigation. And so we have roughly $100 million of hazard mitigation money that is still being awarded out and allocated out, mostly through FEMA and with some state dollars. Hazard mitigation projects, and you'll be able to see it in the spreadsheet that I shared, far too late for you to review in advance.
I'm taking a look at it right now.
But there are some hazard mitigation, some climate resiliency projects mixed in there. And being small towns, we found that none of the small town projects fit the cookie cutter categories very well. We were able to get the categories supported and justified under the initial categories in MTAP. But in a lot of cases, those projects were very unique to that community, and they had to do with an old church or an old community center and how they were trying to reuse that resource.
What happens if we don't appropriate the $3 million going forward?
If you don't appropriate the $3 million, there's $1.5 million of projects that are identified for high needs communities that don't have the resources to do that work on their own, that will likely not move forward. So they will likely stall out. They might be able to find a different source of support somewhere else, but they probably won't, because for years they haven't been able to find that support.
They aren't flood mitigation things and ARPA related things. I mean, the ones I'm looking at don't look like they are. They're town hall upgrades.
Yeah, there's some town hall upgrades, which is important for emergency resilience. There's the biggest category that we've tried to support is water systems.
Yes.
Upgrading, expansions, moving into more resilient areas. That's where we've got a lot of policy overlap.
And there was, in that ARPA money, there was money that could be used for a variety of purposes that. But so I have it straight. $3 million, the basic needs for that money is for communities that didn't have the expertise to put together the paperwork, the grants, and whatever, in order to get the money and put a project on the ground.
Yes.
And the RPCs did about half of that work, and they were paid. They're getting paid for the work they do. In that sense, and then the rest of it is up to the towns or whoever is doing the work to hire somebody to do that work with that. What's the rest of that money, right?
The rest of the $3 million, that's supporting, so Johnson and Barry, multiple towns have been getting Vermont Council on Rural Development's requirements gathering, community information gathering sessions, which are really needed before you can figure out exactly what projects you want to do. So that's one of the things we're paying for with MTAP. So we're paying for facilitators and project managers and things like that to help towns move things forward. But Rep. Harrison's comment was accurate, very earlier that while this money is going into planning and might help construct, like Town of Athens got their first town plan ever with this money. It won't build buildings. It's not capital money, but it's all the management and the plans and trying to meet the state and federal requirements.
Right, so this money is the money to administer, essentially, to put together and do what's necessary to get the project going. And without that money, how many millions of dollars of the federal money won't be expended? It will be a lot, right? Substantial amount.
So with the federal programs, there's likelihood that we will not competitively acquire that funding, right? So it's
You're gonna lose.
with the ARPA funds, it's more about the distribution and who participates. We're going to be able to spend all of that money. We have more than a big enough list of projects. But our larger communities, they've got their work list ready. As soon as our program's open, they slap it on the table and our bigger communities can consume our entire program budget from day one. The smaller communities take more time and don't always know.
Are they programs that would fit under ARPA?
Yes, in many of these cases, but you're right that some of the projects don't necessarily fit a current ARPA program. On the unfunded list, that unfunded list in particular is not all approved, not all recommended. There are some in there that wouldn't. But I think it's about 80 to 90% fit well, and then there's about 10% in there that might not get supported.
So that $3 million, aren't they drawing that? Is nobody drawing that money down? I mean, they should be doing the work in terms of writing the grant proposals and doing all the other administrative things that need to be done with it in order to get that money. So isn't that money, why isn't that money being drawn down? Why would there be a lot of money left at this point in time?
So of the initial 3 million, we're paying invoices every month that's moving that money out. But we set up the program intentionally to provide certainty to these small towns. So it was expected when we set it up to be paid out over the course of several years. So I think we're actually on pace to spend it at how we thought we would spend it.
The original 3 million.
The original 3 million.
3 millions. And so
Right.
as of June 30th, there was 2.4 million left.
Yes.
And so how much is left now?
I didn't run the balance recently.
Might be helpful for us to know at some point, if you can do that easily. I've got Lynn and then John.
Yeah, my understanding is that you're talking about the planning and getting organized and helping give some support to these people who are in small towns. My understanding is that they got their own ARPA money through a community or from their county that was given to them, and this is what they're supposed to be using to do the jobs that you're now trying to help them plan and organize so that it gets done. Is that correct, number one?
So the ARPA funds the local fiscal recovery that went directly to towns, is a source of potential funding for projects.
That they couldn't organize on their own as well.
Many of them made decisions about that, and that's easier because they've got the money in-house. It was all classified as revenue loss from the federal perspective, so they don't have to justify their projects. So that money actually, that local fiscal recovery money that they got directly, they being the towns, they don't really have to apply for that or figure out how to meet requirements to use it. In many cases, that money is a helpful source of providing local match for a bigger federal project that they want to apply for.
Good.
So I think they still need to figure out what the big project is. And that money, I believe it ended up being somewhere around $300 per person for Vermont. Yes, it was about $300 per capita. And in most cases, especially if you're talking about a water system upgrade, that local fiscal recovery money is not going to be enough to pull off the project by itself. But it could be a very valuable source of matching funds.
Okay, the second question is, are they required to have this money spent by December of 26, just like the other ARPA money? I mean, it had to be obligated by December of 24, and then you have another 2 years to spend it. Is that still something that applies to this money and the things that they're doing?
Yes and no. So yes, in that it has to be formally expended by 12/26. It had to be obligated as of a couple of months ago. we've been working with the League of Cities and Towns to provide policy advice for the towns. Every town except Burlington in Vermont was under the $10 million revenue loss threshold. So they were able to expend that money on general purposes of government. And our advice to them was formally expend the money with Treasury on general purpose of government and create a fund of your own town money with that, do a 1-for-1 exchange and then figure out what project you want to do, but don't do it on Treasury's timeline. So all of the towns, if they did that, and I believe nearly all of them or all of them did that properly, should have as much time as they need to figure out what exact project they want to spend the money on.
So is this $3 million under that timeline, or is that not applicable?
No, this would be general fund, and it also would be intended to support other programs, EPA programs, things that are outside of the scope of ARPA.
Okay, so, John and then Jim, and then we're gonna move on. This is the first one, and we have 3 more to go through, so.
Real quick here, and you may or may not know this here, but I mean, how many towns are in the mix of taking advantage of this, not having been able to because they didn't have the expertise to get their paperwork together, or they just simply need help with some guidance to move ahead on this with the 2.4 million or whatever the balance is at this stage.
With the,
It's kind of more of a practical question on my part here, just to get a little bit more context here. This helps.
so we funded the RPCs to go out and hold these community needs assessments meetings. And they did that for every town that was on the Vermont Community Index, which initially was a little over 60 towns. So 1/4 of the towns in Vermont. Then we expanded it so that towns that were above 50% on the index, so half of Vermont towns, 126 towns, 125 towns were eligible and got that initial needs assessment conversation. Through the RPCs, we established 46 project statements of work for projects that met the general criteria of MTAP and towns wanted to move forward with. We supported a lot of project development through those other groups like Council on Rural Development and DHCB. And so a lot of that was requirements gathering, figuring out what the community needed so it doesn't translate to, this number of projects. But in the allocation of those projects, just over $1 million of it was allocated to projects for towns that are above 50% on the index. And then after the floods, we made an allowance for towns that were between above 25% on the index to also apply for MTAP support if they had an eligible project.
So meaning a project ready to go or just one that would fit into the mix of this?
One that would fit into the parameters of the program, because we often talk about shovel-ready projects. And again, that's something that always favors the towns with more professional staff and tends to skew our programs towards those more developed, more supported projects. So a lot of this has been that initial needs assessment and project development work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Last one, Jim, and then we're gonna move on, I promise.
Doug, what am I missing? I looked at I just totaled the unfunded projects on your second tab, and it totals 1.3 million.
Mhm.
So it begs the question, we're spending $3 million for assistance to help towns get 1.3 million. Am I missing? I'm maybe looking at it wrong.
So the unfunded projects list is the amount of assistance they're asking for. That assistance is related to projects which can range between $2 million and $30 million. So there's no direct ratio, and I've had a lot of conversations with the regional planning commissions about when you invest in project development, like how much does that generally result in as far as project value? And there's no strict ratio. You try not to spend more than 10% on planning activities. But I would say that the total value of the projects, the 46 projects that are on the funded side, it's well above a 10-to-1 ratio of the total value of the project relative to the support that we're giving. So usually we're giving $50,000 in support for a $5 million project that a town is working on.
Okay, this is better picture. That was helpful. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to the next one, which was, not sure which one we're gonna do next. There's two on page 23.
The municipal buyout reimbursement.
Well, there's that one, that's E 142.2, and kind of have a lot of it. That is on page 25 of the language that we got. It's, yeah. E 142.2, subchapter 4C, municipal buyout reimbursement program. And this is new, this establishing a program, and it sounds like you're going to, the proposal is to, for properties that are deemed not livable, right? That they're gonna backfill the property taxes to the communities, 100% for 5 years and 50% for the next 5 years. And this feels like a huge black hole.
Well, so I think.
Maybe you can explain it better than I just did.
I'm sure. So I would say that, for one, there's always been limited funds to conduct buyouts in Vermont. We have more funds available to conduct those buyouts right now than we have in the past, right? We have the big grant from FEMA to do hazard mitigation. We have roughly, you know, at one point or another, we've had up to 200 households that are interested in buyouts.
Mhm.
And we have many situations where, like in the city of Barrie, for example, they're in a very difficult position where certain neighborhoods, certain parcels have applied for buyout, but the city is not able to approve that buyout because they don't see a path to making their municipal budget work without the tax revenue represented by those pieces of land. So what this attempts to do and is establish a system, at least on this, related to these recent events, where yes, the municipality gets reimbursed for the municipal portion of the property taxes for 5 years if they approve the buyout. So it's prioritizing getting people out of harm's way. And right now, the fact is, these communities, not only do they have to make the budget work in the meantime for operations, they also have to figure out how they're going to replace that housing stock somewhere else. So if they can't make their base budget balance, then they're not even going to be able to contemplate, okay, how do we replace these housing units somewhere else, somewhere safer in town? And so the request for this, it's a big concept, but if you look at how much in municipal taxes is actually collected related to properties going through buyouts, you ask for $1 million of appropriation on the pilot special fund. And that would be sufficient to cover at least the first full year of activity. Likely, it would take several years to consume that amount of spending authority. And it would be, and the other reason, maybe it's just my history with the tax department, that I anchored it to the pilot special fund, that's collected and funded through local option taxes. So it's a municipally gathered revenue. And then this would put it towards the use that benefits municipalities. But also the local options tax is generated in our local and regional economic centers. And this would be a way for that activity that's happening in those economic centers to benefit towns that are really needing assistance and needing a short-term balancing mechanism. So that the hope is they can replace that housing stock within that 10-year timeframe, and then we don't need to continue reimbursing.
So you're thinking it'll be $1 million a year, maybe. I don't know. What's the motivation if it's 5 years at 100% and 5 years at 50%? That's 10 years. What's the motivation for a community to do anything?
So the motivation right now is flipped. So that right now they don't, and all the municipal leaders I've talked to, they're worried about the long term. So they need time to get through this transition, and we can help support their decision-making by helping them through the 5-year period. But collecting half the revenue, all the budgets are so tightly balanced right now that half the revenue is not going to cut it. So they need to replace some of that housing before the 5-year window is up. And I think we recommend buyouts in the spirit of public safety. If it's going through buyout, that means it is not a safe place for people to live from a public safety, from a state of Vermont opinion. And so this shares some of the responsibility for getting out of that situation and helping our communities adapt. 100% is the proposal, but I think the concept is the state is the one recommending that we get people out of harm's way, and then the municipalities are the ones that bear the full financial brunt of that decision.
I mean, I'm just gonna move us along. I'm sorry, I'm feeling the
Yeah.
pinch of time here.
Public safety just told us that they had money for buyouts, right?
Yes,
So if that money is used for a buyout, they told us that that property would then belong to the municipality. So at that point in time, this tax, if that happens, then this tax thing is moot, or you're gonna pay them on top of.
yeah, so how did, that was, I think, was at the.
That's the exact situation this is intended to address.
We're gonna pay them, we're gonna give them the property, which they might be able to use for something, not house. And then we're gonna pay the taxes for them too.
So when the municipality agrees to a buyout, they have to agree that that property can only be public, open space, green space. It can no longer have a grand list value attached to it. It is zero on the grand list forward. Now, Dog River Park and other redevelopments show those green spaces do help boost the value of the neighborhood. But it is a 5 to 10 year transition from, flood damaged properties to a situation like Dog River Park. It takes time to get through that transition.
So John, Mike, did you have a question too? or-
No.
No, okay.
So if there's a structure on that property, and the municipality owns that, there's going to be a cost to the town as well to kind of perhaps have to remove that structure.
The grant,
It's not usable.
the grant will,
Business that.
yeah, the grant will cover and requires the removal of all structures.
Okay.
So the feds and the state will pay for the removal of structures. If there are environmental issues on site, the municipality may have to pay for the remediation of those environmental, like brownfields issues.
Thanks for that clarification.
Do we know if the Vermont League of Cities and Towns thinks this is a good idea?
Yes, I have discussed it with them. They of course have opinions on various ways pilot could be used. They're generally open to this concept. I wouldn't say they've had a full vote and everything like that, but generally open to it.
Check with the LCT. That'd be great. Okay, thank you. Next one, please. Back to page 23. There's two things on there. The first is up at the top. This is the one that we didn't do in budget adjustment, the 30 million to be used as non-federal share related to disaster spending. And we did approve the 15 million that was above it in the budget adjustment to expand the usage. That was the one you were worried about, but we didn't really talk about the 30 million. Right. Because we didn't really have a lot of time with that.
Is that time of year, Madam Chair?
Yes.
So this 30 million, it originally, of course, for state match directly for the 2023 flooding event. Wow, okay. And even that event, we are still negotiating a lot of things with FEMA. It is still taking us a lot of time. So we still have about $28 million out of that appropriation. And that's not unexpected. It is disappointing that we're not farther down the road and we don't have a clear picture on exactly how much state match we'll need for that event. Our initial estimates were 37 million, but that could shift, that could drop pretty significantly if FEMA doesn't approve certain aspects of projects, right? It's not likely to go up above that initial estimate of 37 million.
Is this for state buildings?
For state buildings,
Just for state buildings?
yes. So originally it was just for state buildings. What this language proposes to do to broaden it to non-federal share and open it up so that we can use it for the state match related to the 2024 floods as well.
Which is not state buildings?
The primary motivation for the broader language is under certain conditions, FHWA for road damage will require cost share. And so this language would allow AOA to use that money to make sure that the cost share for FHWA disaster repairs isn't borne by the T fund.
Okay.
And
But we don't know how much would be T-fund or transportation related versus state.
right, and that's why we didn't want to, parse it out, directly allocate. I do know the T fund could be relatively significant, not to the level of $30 million, but I think up to somewhere around $5 million. And it didn't feel right asking for more match money from the legislature right now.
Yeah.
Given that we have $28 million in an appropriation, we thought we should spend it, get more clarity on what the future need might be. It's likely that there will be a top-up needed at some point in the process, but we might still be a year or two away from asking for more match money.
So is the first priority state buildings and the second priority transportation?
I think we owe.
Transportation sucking it all up and.
No, they wouldn't be able to suck it all up because it would have to be directly related to the disaster repairs.
Yeah.
And it would only be for the category of disaster repairs. So we wouldn't allow it to go into other road work. It would be reviewed and approved by agency of administration to make sure that it is related to the disaster work.
So is the first priority those state buildings? And
Thank
second,
you, Madam Chair.
it could be?
Yes.
Great. Any other questions on that one? We got one more to go and then we'll get Emily back. Thank you. ERAP, same page at the bottom, E100.2, 14.3 million. It originally said 5 million.
Yes.
And I have stuff about something with ARPA and GF, and that may be all wrong, so just tell us what it is.
So agency of administration originally asked for 5 million of authority to apply Erie to eligible expenses somewhere in state government, take any general fund that was freed up by that and use it. And the main motivation for this was that Treasury identified $4 million of expenses through our work with Vermont State Housing Authority that we thought was eligible. And they've identified was not eligible. It was actually repairs for affordable housing to prevent eviction. There was mold remediation, roofs that were leaking. We repaired the building so that, and these were covenant restricted affordable housing. These were not private units. In most cases, there were some private landlords where we gathered all the income information to make sure it was serving right population. But in most cases, it was covenant restricted affordable housing. We repaired those so those people didn't end up out on the street because they were facing an eviction order if those repairs weren't done. And so we prevented people from being evicted and we classified it as eviction prevention.
Yeah.
And Treasury reviewed our actions and said, no, that's not an eligible activity. You're going to need to remove that from the ERA2 list. So this 5 million allowed us to remediate that situation. A couple of months ago in either November or December, it's all a blur, but under the Biden administration, so I don't want it to be conflated with the transition of administration.
Yeah.
US Treasury began sending demand letters to states saying any fraud, waste, or abuse that we identify in your program, the state must pay 100% of that back to US Treasury. That is an extremely aggressive and unfair position given how federal programs operate. There is in fact tolerance levels in every federal program of up to like 10% fraud. And however you feel about that, but they issued Massachusetts, for example, a demand letter and said, if you don't pay us, interest will begin to accrue.
And that was the 2 billion or something like that they.
There was some pretty
It's a wild amount.
some wild amounts.
Okay.
And so this authority, there's 14,300,000 left in the ERA2 fund. It has to all be expended by September 30th of 2025. That's when the period of performance ends for this federal grant.
Yep.
So we at AOA want to take this authority, figure out how to place that 14.3 million against the lowest risk activities that we can, regardless of where they are in state government, and then take that money and make sure that we balance the scales and we have a low risk profile with Treasury. So we're trying to do some preemptive risk reduction here. We've scoped out how much we have in risk as far as the fraud payments, and that's just over $4 million. So we have at least $8 to $9 million of money that we need.
Is that, I'm sorry, is that 4 million in addition to the original 4 million?
Yes, additive, yes. So just under 9 million of money that's like, okay, we really need to do this. But since there's $14.3 million left, until you get in there and you really work through everything, you sometimes don't know what you don't know. So we wanted to be able to move up to the remaining amount of expenditures to make sure that we protect ourselves as much as possible.
So is this essentially ARPA money that was cured?
Yes, it would be the same kind of approach as the ARPA curing process. Yes.
And yes.
Please, I think this is going to be your area.
Well, it
I'm not
might
sure.
be.
I think it might be.
So this was money that was originally targeted for rental assistance, is that right? Subsidies. And where did that live?
So the largest program was run through the Vermont State Housing Authority. Vermont, being the we there, distributed well over $200 million of rental assistance benefits through that program. And so when you're talking about that large of a pool, Treasury identifying $2 to $4 million, $4 million is a lot of money, but out of $200 million,
Right.
it's proportionally not that much.
Okay.
And then we also did housing stability services through the Department of Children and Families, eviction protection, prevention activities. That was roughly $15 million of the spending was in that support services area for housing stability services, they were called.
So the money that was cured was located both at PSHA and at DCF.
Sorry, to clarify, nothing has been cured yet.
Okay.
So nothing. We have cured, out of the $5 million authority we initially got, we have cured 250,000 at this point to remediate one situation. So we've used 250 of the 5 million at this point.
Okay. And so the difference between the 5 and the 14.3 is new general fund money?
Well, it would be increased authority to perform these swaps.
Okay.
Well, we would only perform a swap if we're confident it's lower risk than where we have the money right now, that it meets all the federal criteria. And then it would be applying the ERA 2 to that previously expended general fund and moving that general fund
Okay.
forward.
Okay. And if you do that, you don't have the deadline of September 2025. Is that, do you go longer? Or do you have that deadline regardless?
Yes, however, I would clarify for ARPA, part of the motivation was to give ourselves flexibility. For emergency rental assistance, that program has ceased to run. The only place we're actively spending money with emergency rental assistance right now is housing stability services. So we theoretically could buy ourselves a little bit of flexibility with that. But I think we have, mostly this is a risk reduction attempt. And about 9 million of known issues, and then $5 million in case we identify other issues that we need to resolve. Or if Treasury comes to us after the fact in a year or two and identifies an issue, this would allow us to cure that issue much more easily.
Yes,
Does that
no,
work
that's
for you?
good. Thank you
Okay,
very much.
great.
I
All right.
understand.
Those are the 4 things. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time, the work you're doing on this. I just can't imagine what your office looks like with spreadsheets for every program all over this. And we can ask you a question and you have the answer. So we really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Madam Chair.
Okay, thanks very much. We're gonna get Emily and Brady back up. Okay, I think we'll be fine. Putting our hats back to budget adjustment. Is it just the spreadsheet we need at this point?
I mean, Brady did all the language, so I don't know if you need it.
Brady can,
We'll have him wait in the wings.
we have a short spreadsheet about the money with the treasurers, and then we have a big long spreadsheet.
Yeah, so maybe we'll start with a big long spreadsheet. Which should look familiar. The only difference being is there's now a Senate column. Added, I should say, for the Emily Byrne from the Joint Fiscal Office for the record. So in the sort of base adjustments, section. The only change, the House only had that small change related to the Secretary of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. As Grady spoke about when he went through the language, there's the $50,000 for the position at the Attorney General's office and $62,000 for 2 new positions at the Human Rights Commission. For total base changes of $110,000. If we go down to the next section, so go down to line 66.1 and 66.2, these two work in concert with each other. So Grady spoke about the language related to the municipal grant programs to help towns that were impacted by the floods. In the FY 2024 Budget Adjustment Act, there was money for municipalities impacted by the flood in 2023. And then in the FY 25 big bill, there was an additional appropriation made to help towns in Addison County that were impacted by floods. At the time, that appropriation was $200,000 because that was the best estimate that we had for the damages of the towns in Addison County. It turned out that the damages were closer to $350,000, but the Agency of Administration only had an appropriation of $200,000. So what this does,
They didn't give them anything.
they didn't give them any, nothing went to Addison County. So what this does is reverts the 200,000 or eliminates the appropriation of $200,000 that was put in last year's big bill. And then the language that's added is a total of $1.8 million of money to go to towns that were impacted by the flooding in Addison County in 2024 and then, or 2023, and then the July 2024 flooding that happened in Washington, Lamoille, Caledonia counties. So this is sort of, it's 2 transactions, which is why it's shown differently, but we sort of repurposed that $200,000. And in that $1.8 million calculation is the $350,000 for Addison County.
That's where we're gonna get the chart of the.
Yep.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay.
So then the next change is down on line 75, the other transfers. As Grady spoke about when he went through the language, there's $220,000 that's going to the Emergency Personal Survivors Benefit Fund so that the treasurer can make payments per statute from there. And then the last change is on line 88, which is the additional reversion from the treasurer's office of the full $20 million that was set aside for the debt repayment that the House took the 14 of. And then this shows up as a reversion because there was 6 million sitting in the old appropriation. So we revert the remaining that's in the old appropriation. So that brings the Senate construct. They bring in the 6 and then they spend around 2 of it on the grants to municipalities, a little bit for the positions, and then for the Survivors Benefit Fund. So they have an additional about $4 million on the bottom line that will be utilized in FY 2026 as compared to the House. If that makes sense.
So. Theirs is another 4 million. Right. Okay. Got it.
Not a lot of changes, but so.
And then the description of the money is actually on the short page.
The short
That's kind of the.
that we put together that has orange and blue on it. It just walks through both what the House did with the $14 million where that was spent. I believe you had a sheet that had that summary on it, and then we added what the Senate did. So the ins and outs there. Total.
It'd be like 100,000 on the bottom line ourselves. Oh. And they only spent 2.13 of the 6 million. So. Is that making sense to everybody? On what they did? Okay.
And then I can go.
You have a question?
Sure, just on, line 18, which is the, adding $62,000 to the Human Rights Commission. If that passes, if those are permanent positions, we would need to account for them in the big budget.
Yes.
Yeah.
Same with the position at the Attorney General's office.
Oh, sorry about that. Usually on mute. Because I have a meeting in 10 minutes. Okay. Are there any questions about clarifications that you need to understand what the Senate did versus what we did? What we kind of did? I'm not asking if you like it, I'm just asking if you understand it. Okay, if not, if we're, Tom, Jim. Over here.
When appropriate, I would make a motion to not concur with the Senate.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't concur with the House either, so.
So you're very consistent, very.
Transparent. So I'm consistent.
And would you further recommend that we do a quick conference?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there a second to that? John seconded that. This is not an official vote, so if we're doing a straw poll, so all of those who agree that, oh, yes.
No, I didn't. No,
Okay,
I was pointing.
he's pointing at you. Yeah, okay, that's great. So it's been moved and seconded that we have a straw poll so that we request the committee of conference. If you agree, would you just raise your hand? We won't go around the room. Looks like we are unanimous. Okay, thank you very much. It's nice that we all agree. I appreciate it. Our first 11-0 vote. Congratulations.
Really? I thought we had one up to there.
Oh, we did.
We did.
This is about us, though. This is a special one. So, let's see, committee, we're celebrating chocolate. Why?
It's going around.
Let's start back here at 1:30 instead of 1 o'clock. I may have to meet about the budget adjustment act. And so then we'll just start back. You don't have any committee letters yet? No. We'll just continue and do the best we can and check in with where we are at least, and we'll see if we need to continue along on what we've got. So we'll meet